All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight's speaker event is being recorded. My name is Emily Spence, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome, and thank you for attending and supporting tonight's talk. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our friends at Hubtown Tours for their continued support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. Before we get into tonight's event, I want to tell you about a few more events that we have coming up this year. Our next speaker series event will be on November 5th. Musicologist Laura Zoll will be joining us to discuss various types of 18th century music and the roles they played during the Revolution. And if you're in the Boston area this month, there is still time to join us for an after-hours crypt tour. I can't think of a better way to get into the spooky season. And now, our speaker tonight poses to you all this question. What if America's founding wasn't inevitable? It's easy to look back on the writing of the Constitution and take for granted its success and the line that begins it, we the people. But long before the Constitution, and before that, the Articles of Confederation, colonial Americans spent over a century struggling to unite and mostly failing spectacularly. These weren't just boring political experiments. They were high-stakes gambles involving real people grappling with questions that still feel relevant today. Here to tell us more about these overlooked American experiments is Liz Covart. We are so lucky to have Liz with us this evening because she has a true gift for turning dusty archives into riveting stories. As creator of the award-winning Ben Franklin's World podcast, she's brought early American history to thousands of people across more than 400 episodes and more than 13 million downloads. A PhD historian with serious academic chops, Liz has served as founding director of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios and digital projects editor at the prestigious Omohundro Institute. But she's not content staying in ivory towers. She co-founded Clio Digital Media and the History Explorers Club to connect everyday history lovers with cutting-edge scholarship. Liz believes the most important stories are the ones that help us understand who we are and how we came to be who we are. And now, I'll remind you to mute your microphones and please put any questions that you have in the chat. There will be time at the end for Liz to answer these questions. All right, Liz, take it away.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm always excited to talk about some of the research I do when I'm not producing podcast episodes. And if you've listened to the podcast, Ben Franklin's World, then you know that I love to uncover forgotten stories of people and events of early America. And today we are going to look at one of those kind of lost stories that has been lost in the archive. And that overlooked story is about the United States' very first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. How did the framers of this constitution draft it? What were its goals? And how did the nation ratify this form of government? These are questions that I've had, and I don't really have any answers for you tonight about that because this project is still kind of in the early stages. But I would like to start about the Union. Uh, why, after 150 years of failure to create a union in British North America, did the colonies turned states finally come together to form a union that was perpetual? It's like we couldn't agree to get married before, but now all of a sudden we're going to get married in a shotgun wedding and it's going to be a permanent thing. And so these are questions that I find fascinating because if you know about early America, I mean, you know about New England, right? We have rivalries with everyone. New York, Boston, New York rivalry, New England, New York rivalry. Virginia and Maryland are just as bad. So is Pennsylvania and Maryland, Pennsylvania and New York. So there's rivalries all up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And I would venture to say, as we go out further west, there are also other rivalries. And so the idea that they would come together in a union after trying so hard is very fascinating to me. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. It does have a different name, but the subject matter is the same. So you're in the right place. So why was union so hard for people? The people who populated what is now British North America didn't start as one people. They didn't all start as Britons. The most homogeneous region in what is now, what was then early America was New England, where the English colonists established settlements in large family groups. And we also see some French Huguenots, Dutch traders, Germans, and other Europeans coming in. But by and large, the population of New England is very homogeneous. So they're actually not a great example of the kind of cultural diversity that we will see throughout the colonies. Now, before there was the establishment of New England, there was the establishment of New Netherland. Dutch traders established seasonal trading posts at what we now know as Albany. Albany actually came before New York City or New Amsterdam. New Albany was settled in 1614, 1615. It was called Beverswijk or Fort Oranje, Fort Orange. And today's New York City was actually established in 1625 as New Amsterdam. Now, scholars who study New Netherland, which incorporated parts of today, we have to think more broadly than just New York. It actually incorporated parts of what we now know as Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and only about half the population who settled in New Netherland were actually Dutch. See, the Dutch were in the middle of their golden age, the Gouden Eeuw. That's how you say that in Dutch. But the middle of their golden age. And so life was good in the Netherlands. So it was a really hard sell for the Dutch to be like, hey, why don't you move to one of our Caribbean or South American or North American colonies? So what they would do is they would take Germans who, I mean, we say Germans, but it's all principalities at this point in time. So that people from what is now modern day Germany would go over, people from the Spanish Netherlands, what is now present day Belgium, would go over because this period is also during the Dutch Revolt and the 80 Years' War against the Spanish Empire. You do see a lot of Spanish and Portuguese Jews settling in New Netherland as well, and throughout the Dutch Atlantic world. So there are so many different types of people who are settling in New Netherland. And eventually they come together to have a shared New World form of the Dutch language. But their religion is all over the map. There's Dutch Reform. Some of them do, participate in Anglican services. There's Lutherans. There's Jews, as I had mentioned. So there's a lot of religious diversity in that region. So this is one possible reason why there wasn't union sooner. And then we go further south down to Maryland and Virginia. They're also predominantly English in those colonies, but we also see a lot of Germans, Scots, Irish, Dutch, and other settlers settling in this region, plus a lot of different African peoples who are being brought over during the slave trade. And yes, New England did have slaves, but not in the quantity. Virginia would always have the most enslaved people of any place up through the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery in the 13th Amendment. So they have a lot of population diversity. Now, the Carolinas were a little bit different. They had higher populations of Highland Scots, Scotch Irish, and Irish. Plus, they also had Germans, and a lot of those also settled in North Carolina as well. There were a lot of Englishmen in South Carolina because South Carolina got its start when these Barbadian planters decided they needed more land and more opportunities to grow cash crops, so they came over to South Carolina. Georgia happens to be pretty similar to North Carolina in terms of its population. So I think you can see there's a lot of different European populations mixing. There's a lot of different enslaved African populations that are mixing. And then we have the indigenous peoples who are too numerous to count, and also going through their own phases of kind of consolidations of people like the Catawba, or kind of historically like an amalgamated people of different smaller tribes that came together. So there's a lot of indigenous people out there as well. So there are a lot of regional differences that are happening throughout um, what is now, we think of the eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, in addition to these cultural differences, there's also a lot of economic and trade rivalries and differences between these regions. And I'm broadly going to categorize them as New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South. So in New England, as you know, we do not produce cash crops here. It's just too cold in the winter and the soil is very rocky. So it's great for husbandry and doing dairying and butter, but not so great if you want to make a lot of money selling wheat. And tobacco grows here, but not in the quantities or quality that you would need to make any money out of it. So many of its people became merchants who acted as transshippers of colonial goods. They owned sailing ships, and they would kind of run the triangle trade route. So they would go from the colonies, probably up to Great Britain, down to Africa, Africa, back over to the colonies, and there'd be like this circuitous trade route. And of course, the Caribbean is part of that as well, and goods going back and forth. And a lot of that happened in New England bottomed vessels. Now, the mid-Atlantic region also lacks cash crops, but it has more sunlight and warmer weather. If you've ever been to Philadelphia in the summer, well, if you know, you know. It gets pretty hot and humid down there. So that region does rely on farming, and they are able to grow enough wheat and corn and crops that they are able to supply the region with food, sell some to New England and the South and the Caribbean. So they make a little bit of money off of edible crops, but they're not really growing cash crops as well. So there's some rivalry there and some differences. And the southern colonies, they're cash crop heavy. They have the soil to grow food, but they're mostly growing tobacco if you're in the Chesapeake region of Maryland, Virginia, and northern North Carolina. And then they're growing indigo and rice, and later they'll grow wheat and cotton. And when we say we in this time period, a lot of that labor is coming from enslaved people. So we just need to keep that in mind as well. So the fact that you have these regions with no cash crops and some have cash crops, you see a lot of wealth disparity happening between these regions, which creates an economic rivalry. Um, we also have different rivalries in the form of government. So while a majority of the colonies were royal by the time of the American Revolution, those are the colonies where the king appoints a governor, there's governor's council as an upper body of the legislature, and assemblies as a lower body of the legislature, you do have a bunch of charter-based colonies. Massachusetts started as a charter-based colony. So did the Virginia Company, although they fairly quickly convert, I believe, to a royal colony. But Connecticut and Rhode Island would stay charter colonies throughout. You have proprietary colonies, so Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, they start out as proprietary colonies. Um, so that's where, like the Penn family, they own the rights to Pennsylvania, and they kind of run it like a little fiefdom. Benjamin Franklin was always going back and forth trying to get the king to consider making Pennsylvania a royal colony because they thought it would just be easier to deal with than the whims of the Penn family. So there are these differences in economics and governance as well, even in the early period. So regional rivalries make union very hard in this period. And this is when I say this period, I'm really talking about the 17th century through the mid 18th century, the 1770s. Um, but where they did have differences, they also had a lot of issues in common. Indigenous peoples. A lot of colonies are trying to figure out how do you interact with, conduct diplomacy and war with and against indigenous peoples. Westward expansion is a huge deal. I think you knew this, but Connecticut had a charter just like Virginia that went from sea to shining sea. So there's a lot of questions about who owns what land, which land falls into what colony. And some of those differences aren't even going to be decided until after the United States is a thing. And like Massachusetts and New York and Connecticut and New York work out their borders. And that Georgia and South Carolina had similar border issues as well. So they do have those issues. Um, but you are trying to figure out in westward expansion, again, who's going to benefit from the money and the governance of westward expansion. Then you have wartime defense and mutual aid. We tend to forget that early America was a very violent place. There are 4 wars for empire that happen between 1688 and 1783. 4 major wars of empire, plus there's a lot of indigenous and European fighting that goes along, like King Philip's War and the Cherokee War, the Anglo-Cherokee War that will happen on the eve of the Revolution. So there are those types of wars as well. And then there are currency issues and currency shortages. So to make matters worse, not only are there economic differences, but there's economic differences in what constitutes money. So the idea behind the British Empire and all these European empires really is this economic system called mercantilism. The idea is there's only a finite amount of wealth in the world, which means you need to extract the wealth from one place and deposit it in another. And the way empires worked was they would go to a place like British North America, they would extract the trees and the precious metals, the cash crops, all the wealth that North America had, and deposit that back in the British Isles. That was the idea behind mercantilism. And empires go to war because, again, they believe that wealth is finite. So France and England would also like in on the precious metal mines that the Spanish have in Mexico, and all of these colonies would be empires would be fighting for the Caribbean colonies because they grew sugar and coffee and even more lucrative cash crops there. And it's again because they thought that wealth was finite. The problem with extracting all the wealth from one place to another is it means that the colonies are cash strapped and cash poor all the time. The precious metals of silver and gold, they're being deposited back in Europe. So what do you use to trade? So every colony basically came up with its own form of paper money. They would trade commodities. So in Virginia and Maryland, it was legal tender for tobacco. You'd go in and they would use what they call tobacco currency, but really it's just tobacco. They would put the weights of your tobacco on a ledger, and then you'd be able to use that as saying, well, I have X amount of tobacco, X amount of pounds of tobacco deposited with the tax collector, and he says I have this amount of value, and then you take that to the store, and they'd write that down in the ledger. And, so there's money trading hands on paper, kind of like today with the credit cards and things like that. Um, in Canada, they'd actually use playing cards as money. And then decks of playing cards became in short supply. And then there's pieces of eight and things like that. But every place has its own currency, and so do the European empires. So when you go into a North American store, are you dealing in Dutch guilders? Are you dealing in French florins? Are you dealing in British pounds? It's anybody's guess. And so if you're a merchant, it gets really complicated trying to create these ledgers. So all the colonies face these currency problems. And then there's the problem of criminal justice and extradition. If you are a fugitive from, say, Virginia would like to get you back, but there's no reason why Massachusetts or Connecticut would send you back. And it would also be hard for Massachusetts and Connecticut to know that you were a wanted person in Virginia. And so there's it's not a huge problem, but there is a problem of dangerous people going back and forth, and refusing to stand trial and be captured in different colonies. So there is this need and desire for some sort of better criminal justice and extradition system to keep law and order in British North America. And then, of course, there's infrastructure. Roads in early America, they stink. They are rutted. It actually was easier for people to travel in winter because the roads would be less muddy. You'd want them to freeze over in places. Uh, but if you couldn't find a river or be able to travel along the sea, overland traffic navigation became really difficult, which is why you see problems, especially with the regulator movement in central and western North Carolina. They didn't have any good riverways that would take them to the East Coast. They actually did more goods inland travel by the rivers through Virginia and South Carolina than they did with the coastal regions of their own colony. And everybody wants a postal system. This is one of the things that Benjamin Franklin did really well when he was postmaster general for the North American colonies, is he actually went through and instituted a plan of postal systems, a postal system in North America, which he continued as postmaster general of the new United States. But these are infrastructure projects, and everybody needs infrastructure. So these are common issues that all the colonies have together, but they also, again, have those differences. So, despite it all, because there are these common issues, there are actually four attempts to form a union before what is the United States comes to be under the Articles of Confederation. The first one is the New England Confederacy. And the New England Confederacy took place between 1643 and 1684. It was the very first colonial union, and 4 out of the 5 New England colonies belonged to it. And so at this period, we need to look at the fact that Plymouth and New Haven are their own colonies, along with Massachusetts and Connecticut. Now, Rhode Island is a colony, but Roger Williams and those other religious people live there. So they purposely exclude Rhode Island because they do not conform to the Puritan kind of ideals. Like the separatists they can deal with, but the people with Roger Williams in Rhode Island, they decide that they can't. So they're purposely excluded. The whole pact of the New England Confederacy it is like a pact. It's based on mutual aid. So the colonies agree that if they face indigenous attack or war from the French or something like that in the meantime, then all the other colonies would agree to send aid. They also agreed that if they do have a fugitive out and about in the region, that they will extradite that person and bring them back to the original colony. The problem with this type of union is that the union had no power. Massachusetts is like, I am not going to give up power to enforce a union. They would like to direct the whole union, but that kind of belies the point. This is supposed to be a compact of mutual aid and mutual cooperation. But the power of the Confederacy was very much dependent on how much these colonies wanted to cooperate. But even still, they're actually able to cooperate pretty closely from 1643 to 1684. And this becomes a model for the first United States Union, because you do have New Englanders in there designing it. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania would actually be the primary drafter of the initial Articles of Confederation. But fresh in their minds is this example of the New England Confederacy, and some were thinking like, well, how could we make that stronger? And John Dickinson does have some of that in his initial draft of the Declaration of the Articles of Confederation. Now, the next form of union we have is the union that no one wanted, except the Duke of York. The Dominion of New England existed between 1686 and 1689. King James II, when he succeeds his brother Charles II, he was the Duke of York. Now he's the king. He had been given New York by his brother, and it was at first New York was a proprietary colony. It was owned by the Duke of York. It becomes a royal colony when King James II becomes king. What King James decided to do is he's kind of like his grandfather, or father rather, King James I. And King James, he kind of veered on the path of like absolute monarch. There were protections in place from him to stop that, but he was a man who really thought that the power should be consolidated in the monarchy. And the apple didn't fall far from this tree with his son and namesake James II. So King James II decided he was going to reorganize the colonial administration of the Northeast. So what he did was he basically grouped all of the different New England colonies and New York into one government entity called the Dominion of New England. And Governor Edmund Andros was the single governor of this unit, and everyone hated it. People in New York hated it. People in New England hated it. They worked on overriding the Charter of Massachusetts. So this was not a great system that anyone in the colonies liked. And Andros was given, again, with this idea of authoritarianism, he was given very sweeping powers to govern these colonies, including he got to decide what laws would be in place. He levied all sorts of taxes, and he also had the power to suppress town meetings, which didn't go over well in New England, which prides itself on its town meetings. So few colonists really appreciated life in their new dominion. They resented the loss of their, near autonomy and self-government. And so when King William III and Queen Mary II come to the throne, they decide this is the glorious revolution, and in New York and New England, they start overthrowing the government as quickly as they can. They imprison Edmund Andros. They do that in Boston. They arrest Edmund Andros here. This is when you see Leisler's rebellion in New York, and they all feel like what they're doing is restoring the government to order by basically dissolving the Dominion of New England. And after that, the colonies went back to being somewhat autonomous. Now, 10 years after the end of the New England Confederacy, William Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, he attempts to organize all of British America under a union. And so in 1697, he came up with a brief plain scheme for union. Like the New England Confederacy, it was based on mutual aid. The idea was that England would take the lead in governance and defense, but the colonies would basically take the lead on all sorts of local issues. And Penn pitched this to the Board of Trade. He actually, I believe it was February of 1697, he gets to go to the London Board of Trade and he pitches his plan for union, and it just falls on deaf ears, because the crown actually at this point prefers to govern with each colony separately, because it's kind of like the divide and conquer. The colonies aren't so powerful separate, but as we'll see during the American Revolution, they get a little bit more power, or at least they have more leverage when they're united. Now, the one plan of union, the fourth plan of union before what would become the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, the actual union happens, is the Albany Plan of Union. But to understand that, you need to understand the covenant chain. The covenant chain was an alliance between Great Britain and the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people of now mostly present day New York and Canada. And in 1754, Benjamin Franklin, he has to, come up with this last ditch effort, because what happens is, um, Hendrick, this is his Mohawk name. I will not try and butcher that for him, but it's on there. Hendrick, as he was known in English, he basically says, we have this alliance with you, Great Britain, that it's mutual aid. We will come to your defense in war. You're supposed to come to our defense. We're supposed to have exclusive trade rights, but we don't feel that you're treating diplomacy and this trade with us very um, seriously. We don't think that it's going all that well. And so basically, what they had to do was negotiate a new framework for diplomacy, trade, and mutual aid. And the idea was that this covenant chain would be renewed periodically, mostly by the British people giving all sorts of gifts to the Haudenosaunee people. And they symbolized it, kind of like a silver chain, is how it was envisioned. Well, when Hendrick declares that this chain is broken, in 1753, there's already a big feeling that war with France is going to happen soon. Nobody knows exactly when at this point, but it's on the horizon and people can kind of sense that. So Great Britain takes it very seriously that they have to renew the covenant chain, because they need the Haudenosaunee people and warriors in any sort of fight with France. So what they do is they call a new Albany conference. Albany historically had been where the Haudenosaunee and Europeans had met, and treated. This was a source of jealousy between New York and New England, and it was even a source of jealousy just for Albany, because New York City wanted a bigger part in this, and the Albany merchants were like, no. And then the English merchants and New English people felt they couldn't trust the people of Albany, because there was this rumor, and I did another research project earlier. There was this rumor that during Queen Anne's War, so 1702 to 1713, that the Albany merchants were actually causing raids like the Deerfield raid, by provoking indigenous peoples to go out and raid these villages and collect um, war goods, and steal people and steal items, and then sell them at Albany. They were told they'd get a good price. That was New England anxiety. The people of Albany didn't actually do that, but it does become a source of their long-standing rivalry. So there's all sorts of distrust happening, but the British Crown is insistent that this is going to happen. They basically say, fine, we'll hold it at Albany, and they invite all 13 colonies, but only 7 of the colonies come. And it is because, like, colonies, like Virginia will arrange with other colonies to be represented through somebody else's delegate. So all the colonies are represented, but only 7 send actual delegates. So how does the Albany Plan of Union come about? Well, the colonies are there, right? They're there to negotiate with the Haudenosaunee people. They're all in one place. And so Benjamin Franklin pitches them this plan for union. And what his thought was is like, we really do need mutual aid, especially Pennsylvania is thinking this, because with a Quaker majority, or at least the Quakers in power, they're peaceful people and they don't believe in military action. And so they're always reluctant to raise military and men and money to fight a war. So there is that background to it, but there is this idea that, they're at war often enough, everybody needs a bit of mutual defense. And so the idea was all the colonies will unite and there'll be a grand council, and that's where all of the colonies will be represented. Then there'll be a president general, and the crown will appoint the president general, and he'll oversee the council and the administration of the union. So he's kind of like the administrator of the union, where the council is representatives, kind of like today. The House of Representatives go and they meet, and then they conclude business and they go home. But you always have like the executive branch and others overseeing the day-to-day of government. The powers that Franklin proposed this union would have is to raise and command armies. So this is the mutual aid portion. Build forts, because again, the frontier is expanding. The colonists won't stay in one place. And so they have to constantly build these forts on the frontier, again, because they're displacing indigenous peoples, to help protect them from other empires' encroachment and indigenous people. And it will have the power to raise taxes. So here's your solution to taxation with representation. And it was also meant to regulate indigenous trade and diplomacy. So why should New York be the head of negotiating indigenous trade in this region, and Virginia have rights to negotiate with the Shawnee and Cherokee peoples and other regions? The idea is that they would centralize indigenous trade and diplomacy under this union, to make things easier. So Franklin's plan for union, it did consist of those things. He basically gets a lot of people to promote it to their colonies, but it never goes further than that. Because again, just like with the other earlier unions, every colony is basically worried about giving up their autonomous authority and power. So this becomes a point. So there are other attempts to unionize doing the colonies, and you can start to see them after the plan of union that Franklin pitches in 1754. And they start to get a little bit more serious with each iteration. So you have the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. 9 of the 13 colonies meet in New York City with the idea of they're going to coordinate action against the Stamp Act. Then we have the First Continental Congress gather in 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia didn't go, met in Philadelphia. Then you have the Second Continental Congress happening in 1775. 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia, and then you have the Virginia Resolution, which happens in the Second Continental Congress, that proposes independence for the new United States, the ability for that new nation to form foreign alliances, and they also passed a resolution that day that they will form Articles of Confederation to govern their new union. So we do start to see the actions towards union becoming much more coordinated. And I think they get really serious. They start to get really serious around the First Continental Congress, which purpose was really to discuss coordinated responses to the coercive acts, although we're here in Boston, so we can say intolerable acts. They were there to coordinate action. And then in the Second Continental Congress, they really don't, they think more of union because they have to come together quickly as a body of war. Just before this Congress meets, Lexington and Concord happens. So that's April 19th. I believe the Second Continental Congress convenes around May 23rd, 1775. So they have no formal mechanism to keep the colonies united. So drafting this Articles of Confederation become serious. Now, I do think the Virginia Resolution is pretty important. So I put it here: resolved that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. I put this in here because we all remember that first paragraph. We ought to be free and independent states, and then we forget the other two parts of Lee's motion. But this is where the new United States start to get really serious about forming a union. Now, John Dickinson was the principal author of the Articles of Confederation. He starts drafting them in 1777. Actually, in 1777, they will send them off to the states to be ratified, But Maryland's going to hold out until 1781, and they basically only signed because they were promised French aid, and the French say no aid until you sign the Articles of Confederation. Plus, at this point, New York, New York and Virginia in particular, they have negotiated that they will give their Western landholdings, Connecticut as well, to the Union, so that they can be used for the mutual benefit of all the states in the form of war bounties and land sales that can help pay off war debts, which is very appealing and exactly what the small state of Maryland, who was confined to its boundaries, wanted, because they had no Western lands to sell, which means they had no money to raise troops and no money to pay off their war debts. So, in order to come up with this union and to draft it, they had to tackle land boundaries, which I just explained is all about being able to sell lots of land to raise money, to raise, to give away to as soldiers' bounty or to pay your Revolutionary War debts. It also means tackling representation. Delaware and New Jersey and Rhode Island, they all want the same representation that Massachusetts and Virginia have. So the big states versus the small states issues that we'll again see at the Constitution Convention in 1787 come up. There's also the political and economic power of the states. Virginia does not want to be equal to anyone. Massachusetts doesn't want to be under anyone but Virginia, and in many cases they'd like to be ahead, but they don't quite have the population or the money. They all have to think about laws of slavery. Something that we miss in the Articles of Confederation in the initial draft, because it wasn't in the final draft, is that John Dickinson actually penned in the marginalia notes. He was having second thoughts about slavery, and he was a slaveholder. But he was the only slaveholder of the founders that actually manumitted his slaves during the American Revolution. Because I think working on this document really made him think very seriously about what fighting for liberty and equality meant. And he basically wrote in the marginalia, like, we're dealing with these issues. Don't you think we should also just abolish slavery because it's incompatible with our founding beliefs? I've paraphrased there, but that's what the intention of the note was. He also writes women into this first constitution. In his draft, especially when it comes to religious liberty, he says his or her right to religious freedom, which he's not a Quaker. There was family disputes with the Quakers. We can get into that later, but he was a fellow traveler and did believe in Quaker beliefs, but he was just not a Quaker. But that kind of more of a equal version of some form of equal version with the sexes is something that John Dickinson also thought about. He also believed that this government should have the power to raise taxes. And if you know how the Articles of Confederation were eventually passed, there is no power to raise taxes. So the form of government that John Dickinson actually drafted is a little bit more like the federal system that we have now than the government that the Articles of Confederation put in place. And they also had to tackle state autonomy. So would the federal government be more power than the states? A lot of states at this point, you remember, they're fighting a king because they think he's too tyrannical and Parliament's too tyrannical. They think centralizing power is a bad idea. And so they don't do that, excuse me, in the Articles of Confederation that they pass. But the Articles of Confederation do form the very first American Union. So those are like the key moments of union, and they all fail before the Articles of Confederation. And I know what you're going to say. Yes, but that system of government failed too. But I don't care about that. What I still have questions about is how did early Americans overcome their differences, those regional and economic and other differences we were talking about, to form a perpetual union? We think of the union today as perpetual, but that's not actually spelled out in the Constitution. That is a carryover from the Articles of Confederation, where it is spelled out in a perpetual union. So I'm curious about that. How do we get to the point where we couldn't form a union after all, over a century, but now we're going to get married and it's permanent? Um, and again, after more than 150 years, like, how do they decide that this is going to be a perpetual union? I'm also very curious what the ratification of the Articles of Confederation and this new union look like. So Pauline Maier wrote this wonderful study called Ratification, and she takes you through the literature, the state by state, because a lot of that literature has been published by the University of Wisconsin. You can go through the ratification debates, and they have all the newspaper articles and documents and letters centralized in volumes dedicated to each state. Nothing like that exists for the Articles of Confederation. And since Jack Rakov published a couple chapters in his very first book, A New Beginning, I think it's A New Beginning, where he charted the formation really of the Continental Congress and its government. Um, the Articles of Confederation, we don't know what it looks like. And since that publication, what's happened is we have these digital databases of newspapers and letters and more access to information that previous scholars just couldn't access in one place. So I intend to use a lot of these new digitized sources. They're not actually that new anymore, but nobody's done this. I tend to use those digitized sources to look at the ratification to see if we are getting debates. There's the other possibility in that it wasn't really debated because everybody was so concerned with the war for independence. So the constitutional moment that happens in 1787, the government actually has a chance to pause and think because the British and the German soldiers that they hire are not breathing down their neck, and they're not worried about it as at all because it's a peacetime thing. This is very much a wartime government. So how did that happen? And like I said, did early Americans have time to debate the Articles of Confederation? And I don't know if they did, but these are some of the research questions that I'm taking with me um, there. So at that point, that's where this is. I told you it's a very early project, but I'm happy to answer questions or tell you I don't know the answer yet, but we can have a discussion about it. And if you'd like to reach me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. You can check out the podcast or our new virtual community for people who love history. So if you're here tonight, you like history, you're the perfect attendance, but we have live events with other historians, and you will get to meet a lot of like-minded people in a place where you can interact with them. So that's everything. Any
Wonderful.
questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. No, this was really very enlightening. And I think, we hear about the Articles of Confederation, but I think some of those earlier attempts and the ways that they kind of informed the Articles of Confederation, I think, as you said, often get left out. So this was really interesting. So as Liz said, if you have questions for her, I know, or have thoughts on her questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We'll have some time left to have a little bit of discussion. And I have a few questions that I can start off with as I give people a chance to write their questions down in the chat. One thing that struck me as you were talking about some of those early plans, the four kind of plans that you outlined before getting into the Articles of Confederation, was I noticed, especially for the first three, that those early attempts at union really seemed to be based in New England and New York as opposed to the South. And do you think that there's a reason for that to come down to geography or the demographics, or what were kind of your thoughts on that?
I think with New England in particular, I mean, because keep in mind, the Dominion of New England was a union no one but King James II wanted.
Yeah.
I think with the case of New England, it's a case of, as I said, it's the most homogenous region, so people have the most similarities, even as they have very deep religious and other differences. But as we even saw with the Dominion of New England, right? They purposely take the people with the most differences and they decide they're not going to deal with them and include them in their union, which is the Rhode Island settlements. So I do think homogeny has a big role to do with it, and having something powerful like a similar religion to rally around is another thing that would make people want to gravitate towards forming a union.
So another question that I had was, I was also very interested to learn about some of the ideas that John Dickinson had in writing the Articles of Confederation, in particular, his ideas around abolishing slavery and including women. Do you have a sense if that was discussed in the writing of the Articles of Confederation with the other delegates, and kind of what that discussion was?
I know it was discussed because it's in his original draft, and they
Mhm.
discussed his original draft. I have yet to find there's nothing in the official committee of the minutes of the Continental Congress to suggest what they discussed. There's just like little notations. If you've ever read the journals of the Congress, they're actually pretty sparse. But
Okay.
it does point me to who was in attendance at those different meetings, and looking at their papers might yield results. But I haven't had a chance to get to into the nitty-gritty of that particular research. But clearly it was discussed, and clearly both were a no-go because they didn't
Yeah.
make the final round.
Yeah, no, I would be curious to kind of know sort of what, obviously, yeah, it didn't come to fruition, but I would be interested to kind of know what some of those early conversations were. Um, do other folks have questions for Liz? You can feel free to put those in the chat, or if it's easier, if you want to raise your hand using the hand raise feature, you can do that as well.
And you should feel comfortable to ask any questions. I'm the
Yeah,
one that always asks a question that everybody's thinking about, but nobody's answered.
yeah,
No shame there.
yeah. One other question I had as well, and I think you were starting to get into this a little bit. Some of those early attempts at unification, do you feel like they were mostly driven by the colonists or driven by, by England, by Parliament, or English leaders, and and why was that?
I think it varies by the time period. Clearly, the Dominion of New England is pushed on the colonists by the by King James II.
Yeah,
We start to see the revolution happen, right? Because after the 7 Years' War, Great Britain it achieves all this additional territory that now needs to be governed and protected. And so we have several episodes on the podcast. I like Max Edelson's where he talks about how the surveyors came out and they were drawing these really detailed maps of what the new British Empire looked like and what its territories contained because they were trying to figure out how to protect it. And in doing that, in having these maps, the British Empire in London, they were able to basically figure out, okay, there's so and so, there's this many people here, there's that many people here, we can apply this kind of taxation, and this is broadly how we want to organize the new empire. And so the revolution happens out of these tensions of Great Britain would now like to bring in some of that autonomy and make it more centralized, and the colonists push back on it.
that's interesting. That makes sense too, kind of trying to centralize some of their power. You shared your next research questions, and I'm kind of curious what sort of then your next steps in answering those questions.
I need to find time to research it. I every year I go through a spurt where I work on it for like 3 months and then it shelves for 9 months. So
Mhm.
I need to read more about ideas about government and I need to get into the archives more. I've been doing a lot of secondary source reading, which I need to
Mhm.
do still. And then I do have, thankfully, through some universities, some library access, and I know that's privileged. But I do need to make use of it because those fellowships are only like a year or two long. So
Yes.
that'll be my next step is diving into the databases because at some point I'll lose access.
Yeah, great. All right, we have a few questions in the chat here too. Someone said a little unrelated question, but actually not because I was asking Liz about this earlier as well. What form of payment was used between the states for interstate trade?
That's a great question, and it doesn't have like a solid answer. I've looked at enough ledger books to see that, and mostly in New York because my dissertation was about New York and Albany. In those ledgers, they will actually put like New York currency, British pound. They will look at different guilders. So they also do a lot of trade on I was going to call them writs of assistance. It's not that, but bills of, sorry guys, this is what happens after a long day. The bills of exchange. And so that's when you have a trading relationship with a merchant. I would assume they're calculating things in their home colony or wherever they're living throughout the empire. And then they would figure out if you were, say, paying in Massachusetts dollars, based on the land bank that was lived for a little bit, they would figure out the currency differences between them to make them equal. But a lot of, like I said, a lot of this is all happening on paper because they lack the physical currency to change. Now, during periods of war, that's one thing that war is good for, especially the 7 Years' War, because Great Britain makes a big point of actually paying in hard currency to get supplies, which colonists are reluctant to give the army or sell them if they can't have hard currency. And so those are periods where we see hard currency being pretty flush in the colonies. But then we do, like in the 7 Years' War case, we'll see a period of depression that happens afterward as the amount of currency starts to trickle out of the colonies. And it doesn't trickle, it's kind of like a flood out of the colonies as everybody's paying their war debts and things like that. So there's always these fluctuations in currencies. I hope that helps, Lynn. If it didn't, let me know and I'll take another stab at it.
So we have a great question from Victoria here about how did the charter colonies transform to royal colonies? And I may piggyback off that a little bit and say, would you mind maybe just giving brief explanation of the difference between a charter versus a royal versus a proprietary colony?
So charter colonies are a little different because they're granted by charter. So we have to keep in mind a lot of the charter colonies you get happen very early in the 17th century. This is where you see the Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company. The reason that they grant charters is because England has imperial ambitions. Like Spain has been out in the Atlantic world since 1492, and they found these rich, plush gold and silver mines in Mesoamerica, so places like Mexico and Peru. So they're extracting great wealth, and England would like in on it. But at this point in time, in the 17th century, England is not really a European superpower. And it's not even just the 17th century, it actually goes into the 16th century a little bit. So, like, think end of 16th, early 17th century. So, to get these colonies formed, they have to get wealthy people to take an economic risk. They need to get their citizens to fund the settlement of a colony, which means providing for ships, paying for people to go over, sending them with implements that they need to start a new colony, sending them with soldiers that will protect them in the new colony. And this is very, very expensive work. And so a charter results of the fact of Great England at the time will claim governance, like we own it type of thing on paper, right? Because we all know indigenous people are really in the power here in this stage. But they'll claim ownership of it, and they leave a lot of the economic upside to the investors in the colony. Now, what this also means is in a lot of cases, the colonies get to elect their own governor, or at least the company, the shareholders get to elect their own governor, which is a big deal. And we see this play out in Connecticut and Rhode Island, especially because they hold their charters till the very end. Massachusetts Bay gets a new charter. John Bell will know this better, but I want to say it's 1691, 1692. But they become a royal colony, and part of that is just trying to keep Massachusetts in line. They're always troublemakers. Um, New York, they become a royal colony when King James II goes from Duke of York to King James. Pennsylvania is always a proprietary colony. I believe the same of Maryland. At some point, I don't know when, but Virginia switches from being run by the Virginia Company to being run by the English and then the British Empire. So it really varies as to what you have, but the main difference is who's benefiting from the money. Charter, it's shareholders. Proprietor, it's the owner of the colony. And the crown, it's the royal. And it's also an expectation of who's in charge of governance and military protection, at least on paper. So those are kind of the differences of the colonies. Um, and as far as to answer Victoria's question of how did charter colonies transform to royal colonies, it's all kind of circumstantial. Like each colony has its own reasons. And I'm sorry, but I'm not so well versed in the 17th century. I could do that, list that all off the top of my head. But hopefully that was enough of an overview to give you an idea of why there are these different kinds of colonies.
Yeah, no, that was one of the best and most distinct explanations of the three different colonies that I've heard. So thank you for that. So we have another question. Were there British efforts to cause dissension among the colonies?
That's a great question. From what I've read, I don't think that they were actively trying to pit the colonies against each other, but did they maneuver sometimes when it was expedient to get some colony to do an action that they didn't want to do, like to get Pennsylvania to raise troops and build barracks during wartime when they didn't want to? Then I think yes. But I don't think it was ever like this big conscious thing of let's pit the colonies against each other. I think the colonies kind of did that to themselves. And again, it's over those issues that we talked about in the talk: economic, cultural, racial, um, lots of economic issues as well. So
All right, so we have one more question here and it says, I saw a marker in Ipswich, Massachusetts that said the people of Ipswich rebelled against the Dominion of New England. Was rebelling against the Dominion common or was that abnormal? You mentioned the Dominion was pushed on the colonists. To what extent did they rebel, and to what extent did they just dislike? Did anyone in the Dominion actually like the Dominion government in those colonies under it? It's
I'm
a
sure
great
friends of
question.
Edmund Andros liked the Dominion of New England because I'm sure they profited and benefited with power and economic strength. And those, of course, who didn't benefit from it hated it. I don't think it was abnormal for people to rebel against the Dominion of New England. It was just an affront. Because again, Andros could allow town meetings or he could not allow town meetings. So people would hold town meetings, despite him if he said you couldn't hold them. So they really resented the loss of their autonomous power. And in New York, there is also another rebellion. I mentioned Leisler's rebellion, where again they're fighting against this Dominion of New England. And again, a lot of it is who's benefiting from the Dominion and who's not. So those who are not are against it. But keep in mind here in New England, another powerful reason why they rebelled against it. Massachusetts, very Puritan. Edmund Andros and the King, Catholic and Anglican. There's a story of how Edmund Andros, he couldn't get land. Like one of the things that King James sent him here to do was to erect an Anglican church here in Boston. But there was a law in Boston that basically said that non-Puritans couldn't own land. And so that first burying ground you see next to King's Chapel, that existed there, the first burying ground. And he found a loophole. Edmund Andros found a loophole in the law that says nobody owns the burying grounds. And so he built the church on the burying ground. So King's Chapel, that's where King's Chapel is because that's how he got the land. So these are people who came here to get away from Anglicanism, to purify it. And here's the crown basically saying you have to have it and it has to be state supported. So that I think in New England is a major, major cause for rebellion that you don't see in New York. New Yorkers would rebel for other reasons.
I can understand that why that would make him unpopular here in Massachusetts. All right. Well, one last call for any questions, any lingering questions for Liz. But yeah, I just want to echo some of the comments in the chat, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is a real treat for us, and you have some fans in here of Ben Franklin's world, and I know we at Old North are as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you in our audience tonight for joining us and for your questions and helping to bring about this great conversation.
Yeah, thank
And
you
we
so
will.
much for coming and for having me. This was fun and I'm glad you got some nice value out of it. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to have you back soon to discuss more about Ben Franklin's world. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.